Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to my retrospective on Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories. So, there's quite a few things to talk about on this one. I'm not going to necessarily have a review and an analysis because it's a Kingdom Hearts game, and I don't really... I mean, the review is, it's a very interesting and weird game. If you've played the first one, you should play this one. But it's a very, very awkward combat style, so be prepared for it not to feel like a Kingdom Hearts game. To explain a little bit more in detail, and this is kind of why you have to talk a lot. Again, I'm trying not to spoil anything in the first part of this review. The Kingdom Hearts 1 was very much a game that kind of rewarded button mashing. You would get combos, you'll roll around, you would have magical powers that you could use in order to do like long involved attack patterns that you could use, but since they were based off your magic, you couldn't use them too terribly much. And so a lot of the game was just going through repeated ba attacks. In Chain of Memories, weirdly enough, it uses a card combat system where you will have a attack with the Keyblade card, or a cast fire card, or a cast ice card. And what will happen in combat is that you and your opponents will both play cards in order to attack, and if you both happen to play a card at the same time, the one with the higher value will win. So, as a result, you can't really get through the game just spamming. If you spam, you will just get shut down, because what both parties can do, which it's an interesting system, I actually like it, and I kind of like it more than the combat system in the original, except that, well, I'll get into why except. You can combine 3 cards together to form either a 3-attack combo where they add their values together, but you end up losing out on the first card, or you can, if you have a certain, the cards add up a certain way, they actually form what's called a slight, which is a more powerful version of the attack. But again, you still lose the first card that you use that way. So, the issue that this causes, at least in the remake, because that's another thing we need to talk about very briefly. Originally, this game was built for the PlayStation, or for the Game Boy Advance. And I feel like the system worked a lot better there. For the remake, they kind of used the Kingdom Hearts 1 engine and rebuilt the whole game from the ground up, kind of using the attack patterns from the first game, but still also keeping the card combat system. So why is this a problem? Well, for me at least, the problem it comes from the fact that as you're going through and playing, in the original Game Boy, first of all, the camera was a little bit lower to the ground, and so the cards that were being played by your opponent, or, whenever you would play a card, it would actually go down and slightly cut off your view of the combat that was happening. So it was super easy to kind of keep both in your field of vision at the same time. In addition to that, you also, of course, had the fact it was on a Game Boy Advance screen, which is way smaller than my, 38-inch TV. Not to mention, and granted, this may be just a personal problem, because I was streaming, I have to be relatively close to the computer screen, because I also have to be on camera, so I'm only 3 feet away from the 40-inch computer screen. So it was pretty darn impossible for me to... I had to actively move my eyes around the screen in order to see all the relevant information. My hit points were in the upper right. The card that the enemy computer was stocking was in the upper... Sorry, my health was in the upper right. My slides were in the upper right. The slides my opponents were stocking were in the upper left, but the cards actually had played were at the very bottom of the screen, and then the camera was higher, so the centralized action was typically in the middle of the screen. So, and what I found as I was playing, and granted, this may also be a side problem with dyspraxia, I was having a lot of trouble keeping all the information, on hand at the same time. What would happen is that you would have opponents that would play moves, and I wouldn't actually realize they were playing the move until the move started happening. Sometimes I would see the slight come to the middle, but I didn't have time to look at what the total value was, then go through my deck and find a 0, then play the 0 before the move actually hit me. And it was really frustrating, and I feel like in the original system on the Game Boy, that was less an issue, because there was less... The overall information wasn't spread out as much, because it was designed for a handheld system, as opposed to, again, a 38-inch TV screen that you're not very far from. But again, I acknowledge the fact that that's kind of That's an issue with how I chose to play the game, not necessarily an issue with the game itself. Though at the same time, I would say if you're going to take a handheld experience and put it on a computer screen or a television screen, you have to deal with the fact that the information is going to be physically further spread out, and your player may not be able to keep it all in their field of view at the same time. Especially when there's a combat and you've got to actively pay attention to what's going on. I felt like it was this weird mix between the Kingdom Hearts 1 system of avoid your opponent's attack and counterattack when they leave an opening, but also the card counter system, and the two systems just didn't really seem to mesh all that well. And then in terms of the story, again, without getting into too many major spoilers, the story was certainly more interesting than the first game. The first game of Kingdom Hearts really didn't have a story. It was like, the first game of Kingdom Hearts was you're a kid and you're on an island, you get off the island and you run into Disney characters, and you decide to find King Mickey, and you go through a whole bunch of Disney worlds, and eventually you find King Mickey. This story is much, 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 much deeper and more interesting. The story is by far the best reason to play it. I feel like it was a story you could really sink your teeth into. It was an idea, it was a story about, you know, who are we outside of our memories? If our memories are not trustworthy, do we even know who we are? What happens if we remember things that we have forgotten? Does that change who we become? It also serves, after you beat the main story, there's a Riku sub-story that talks about what happened to him and really explores him as a character in a way the first game really didn't. The first game, Riku was just sort of like an edgy 90s cool kid. Like, he really had no real personality other than, yeah, you're Sora and I'm Riku and I'm better than you and you're stupid and hey, let's fight with swords. And that was kind of his whole, like, towards the end, I don't want to spoil too much, towards the end of the game you find out a little bit more about him, but even that doesn't, it ends up not adding to his character, like, at all. So this really this game looks at Riku a little bit more closely, and Riku actually comes out of the game looking a lot better than Sora does. Sora has generic RPG hero syndrome, where, you know, he's idealistic and he forgives everyone and he always, you know, never gets depressed and always goes forward. And, like, the one interesting thing that happened in this game is whenever his memories were getting hardcore messed with, he does actually get really impatient with his friends and yells at them at one point, which was cool to see, but that wasn't really part of Sora's personality. That was, again, an exploration of his memories were being changed and it was altering who he was, but since his memories were changed, that really isn't who he was. So, it was interesting to see, to be sure, but it wasn't really, it didn't make you feel any better. Like, it didn't give you any more insight into Sora's character because it was a fake part of Sora's character. Whereas Riku really got legit full-on character development scenes. And that was super interesting to see. I really I enjoyed Riku's arc way more than I enjoyed Sora's arc in this game. The big reason for that, the other problem that the game system has, and I think this is a game system problem. I think the Game Boy Advance probably had this as well. Though, as I said, there are some extra hurdles that happen when you're playing it the way I was. The big problem that I had with it was that very, very frequently, especially in some boss fights towards the end of the game, like, the boss would attack and the card they were using to attack wouldn't actually show up until the attack was already coming. So it's like, you have to choose between countering and dodging, like, as the attack is hitting you. So it got very, very, very frustrating because it's like the card counter system didn't really work except by RNG. If you happen to have a card selected that beat their attack, you could press X real quick and counter it. If not, you had to dodge, but it was like, if you want to have this card counter system, give people a chance to actually respond. Don't just be like, well, you know, you have this cool system that makes you make strategic decisions and doesn't just let you button mash, except in a lot of boss fights, you don't have time to make strategic decisions, and so it's just like, press X and hope. Maybe you'll be able to stop them. Some of the other ones were actually fine. Some of them had a long wind-up, and you were able to actually counter them just fine. The biggest ones I had a problem with were ones that had a long charge and then an unblockable portion. Riku was bad about this. He would have an attack that he would spend some time charging up, but the thing is, he would just sit there until he was ready to use it, and so very often I wouldn't realize he was using it until the first hit, and then by the time, once the first hit impacted, you couldn't block the rest of the attack. The rest of the attack was auto-hit, you couldn't interrupt it, you were just dead. And he would usually just straight up kill you if he hit with that, so... And yeah, it's another situation where in the upper right it tells you that he's got it charging, but I don't look at the upper right, I'm looking at Riku. Riku's trying to kill me! So, I mean, that was a problem. And to be fair, the game did the same thing for us. We would have moves that would charge up, and then once we used them, there was a move called Lethal Frame that was exactly like this. And then also, like later on, you'd run into bosses that had moves that didn't require cards. When I was fighting Axel, that's actually the reason that you can see. I made this drawing very, like, over an evening one night, just to catharsis after Axel pissed me off so much. It took me like an hour and a half to beat freaking Axel. Because he has a move where he teleports, and it counters your attacks, because Sora will lose track of him, but he doesn't use a card to do it. So again, it was a case of the whole game is based around the idea that if you use a major attack, the only way they can stop it is by using a more major attack. Except for freaking Axel, who has a teleport move that he doesn't have to use cards for. And also counters your moves. And it was just, brrr. That said, I know I'm ranting a little bit here. Overall, the system is fair. You know, I said it took me an hour and a half to beat Axel, and realistically what it was is, after bashing my head against the fight and waiting for RNG to let me win, effectively, I said, you know what, this is stupid. If the issue is that Axel is teleporting, and so my big attack is missing, why don't I just not lead with the big attack? And so I ended up using a strategy where you stun him slightly, and then he can't teleport, because you have a very low damage move that happens to stun him, and from that go directly into the Lethal Frame big move that takes forever to charge up. And then, yeah, Axel can't get out of it. Because he's stunned. Like, he gets to move for about a half second before your move activates, and then you just go and wail on him. I changed my deck to that strategy and beat him first try, baby! So, and at the end of that, that kind of showed me that, no, it's not that the game is unfair, it's that you have to adjust your strategy against certain enemies. But, and so, yeah, it was completely my fault, and I shouldn't have gotten mad at the game for that. But again, I'm of two minds of it. On the one hand, there is a winning strategy if you stop and look at the tools you have and can overcome the tools they have. But it was also frustrating that the game kind of violated its own rule set and let Axel teleport without using cards, even though the entire game that has never been the case and that's never been allowed. So, but overall, I am glad I played it. It made me really, really frustrated. I do feel like the bosses required too much RNG and too much luck. There would be times that you could just utterly destroy a boss, and just because all your cards happen to line up. And other times that, no, that's not what happened at all. I also felt like a lot of the mechanics weren't really explained all that well. You know, because I had to have, you know, chat was having to help me quite a bit. Frankly, chat was helping me way too much. They didn't let me really figure out the game. But there are some of them that they would have to tell me because the game didn't really explain that. One of the big ones is that you have a deck, but the deck doesn't shuffle. It comes in exactly the order you set it up in, which I'm just so used to deck shuffling that I didn't even think about the fact that they would show up in the same order all the time. And then when you're using Riku, he has a duel mechanic where if you and your opponent will use the same numbered card, with Sora it just cancels them both out. With Riku it goes into a duel where both of them will start playing, you know, the enemy will play 5 or 6 or 8 cards and you have to, in a short time period, beat them. Well, so I was trying to scroll through my deck and find the cards that would beat them. But no, you can just, like, button mash and play all the cards in a row and you'll end up... It doesn't penalize you for failing to beat them, so just pressing X a whole lot is way faster than going through and trying to find the right card. But the game doesn't tell you that you're not penalized for not beating them, and so it took me like 5 tries until chat was like, just button mash, it's fine. And it's just, that's not a good system if the tutorial doesn't tell you a key aspect of the best way to accomplish this. So that's also frustrating. At the end of the day, unfortunately, like, a lot of people have told me, there were some people that just straight up said, just skip Chain of Memories, watch the cutscenes. I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad I played it. I think it's a very worthy game. It's just a very different game. And I think a lot of people, if you go into it, like I said, go into it knowing that the combat system is very, very different, and approach it as its own beast. Don't try and approach it the same way you approach Kingdom Hearts 1. It's got an interesting story to tell. It moves the plot in a way more logical and cohesive way than the original game did. And you know what? It really does. More than anything else, it really sets up Riku as a character, and it features the king a lot more, and it is a very, very worthwhile story to see. And yeah, I don't regret playing it. I do feel like when they remade the game, there were some decisions they made that may not have been the best. But it's imperfect, but it's good.